The first one is a project that I was a part of last November. And this is a good example of the documentation of intangible cultural heritage through access to museum collections. So this idea that you could use the collections in your museum to generate expressions of intangible heritage based on people's knowledge of what is in the collections. The main goals of this project, this was a collaboration between many people. My good friend Natasha Lyons, an archaeologist, the Inuvialuit Cultural Resource Center up in the Arctic, an Inuvialuit Communication Society, they're a media production society in the community, the Smithsonian Institution and curators, and then an intellectual property project. So the goal here was to connect the originating Inuvialuit community members to artifacts collected from their region, to build relationships between community members, researchers, and the Smithsonian curators, to reconnect intangible cultural knowledge with material culture, to document intangible knowledge, and then to bring the knowledge back from the museum to the community. So look, it's really far away. Okay, they're way up in the Arctic, up in the close to Inuvik, and the National Museum of Natural History is very far away for them. So this was a really big deal for them to travel all the way to the Smithsonian. Here's a good example of best practices for conservation at the Smithsonian. This is where their collection lives in storage. So these objects are extremely well cared for, and they're in perfect condition. They're beautiful. But it's not that easy to get in to see them. So this is what the space looks like. It's a really big deal for people to touch the objects. These are objects from their ancestors. They bring back a lot of memories, and they inspire people to talk about the objects. This is a knife that was collected maybe 130 years ago in their area. They also like to play with the objects. These are snow goggles that were carved out of wood. So where they live, it's snowy. These are Inuit people. So they like to look at them and think about the way their ancestors would have used them. Christina, I'm quoting you again. This is a nice quote from a reading from Christina's work. She says, "Objects stand for significant traditions, ideas, customs, social relations, and it is the stories they tell, the performance they are a part of, and the relationships among people and between people and places that are more important than the objects themselves." So the objects are very important, but it's not only the object, it's all of the knowledge that surrounds them. So by looking at the artifacts, they have a chance to remember what they know about these objects that they don't see anymore. They get to talk with each other about the objects. And also, they brought their media team with them, so they were documenting what people said about the object. So here, Albert Elias is talking about spears that he remembers and bows that he remembers people using when he was a child. There's curator Stephen Loring from the Smithsonian. Also, elders and youth can work together. So this was a project where young people came with elders, and so here Shani is interviewing her uncle, James Pokiak, who's a polar bear hunting guide. He's a really knowledgeable person. He's talking about spears and various artifacts for hunting. Also, the goal here was to take knowledge home. So Frida Raddy, one of the participants, she's a seamstress, and she was looking at all of these articles of clothing and making patterns and drawing them on paper. Because she was very interested in the transmission of intangible cultural heritage. Her skill is sewing and making patterns, so she made a lot of patterns of many different items in the collection so that she could take that home. And I got this really great email I'm sharing with you here not long after. This was in May from Kathy Cockney, who is the director of the Inuvialuit Cultural Resource Center. She said, "Hi all, Frida has used one of the patterns already, fulfilling the objectives of the project, using the material and bringing it home. She used this one with a bit of modification, used cloth and sealskin. The sealskin top is a bit higher and the bottom is not gathered like the original. They are beautiful. She made 2 pairs for her nieces." So here on the right-hand side is a picture of the sealskin mucklucks, or moccasins. that were in the collection, and then on the other side are the ones that she made after she got home with different materials, but they were inspired by a new kind of, an old shoe that she had never seen before because they weren't made anymore in her community. So it's an example of transmission. Okay, on to a totally different kind of project. This one is called it's Dobes. This stands for something in German, because this is a German initiative, but the translation has to do with the documentation of endangered languages. So we know all around the world there are critically endangered languages that have just a few speakers left. So this is a big, very well-funded initiative that I think has 39 or 50 teams of researchers all around the world documenting endangered languages. Their goal is to record languages as carriers of intangible heritage, right? Oral traditions, personal narratives, traditional activities and cultural practices, finding out who the knowledge bearers are, and collecting diverse languages for comparative study. They use many different kinds of media, depending on what's appropriate. They obtain consent from the people they're working with at the time of documentation. And they collect a lot of contextual information because these are linguists, so they don't just want to have one recording of one syllable of one word. They want to make sure that that stays with the broader cultural context as much as possible. And then everything is archived at the Max Planck Institute in the Netherlands, with multiple copies and a lot of support for caring for these objects. So this is just a map where you can see all the different language groups that are being documented. So this is a project where endangered languages are really thought about as world heritage. This is, the goal here is to preserve endangered languages because the loss of one language is a loss for all of humanity, right, to lose one language. This is their emphasis. So they're really doing what anthropologists used to do a lot and probably still do to some extent. They're salvaging the language because they assume that it's going to become extinct. They assume the language is going to die. So for posterity, for the knowledge of the world, they want to preserve it. So I worked on this project as a documentarian, as a person who went into the field to document video and audio of the language as they studied a language called Beaver, which is the language of indigenous people in the north of Canada in the west. Here's a woman, Mary Francis, who was one of the informants, and this project used a range of methods for documenting language, particularly personal narratives. So there's a personal narrative told by Albina Fournier, a video where Mary talks about the beginning of a story about a bad day. Or Dominique Habitant talks about a story about 3 girls who wanted to marry the stars. So this is a way of documenting intangible knowledge, stories, oral traditions, through the process of documenting endangered languages. But it's not without its problems, this kind of big language documentation project.